All right, everybody. We have another very special guest for y'all this week. A English creator outside of our normal scope of creators, but I'm happy to talk to James Albon. Welcome, James.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going good over here. How's life over in Europe right now, or in Scotland in particular, I should say?
Yeah, I mean it's okay. We've been it's coming up to kind of 18 months of lockdown restrictions in various forms now, so it's a good time to be sitting at a studio desk and drawing graphic novel pages every single day. But it's a bad time for being out in the pub or going out dancing.
Yes. Yeah, we've been lucky over here. So for you, I'm in upstate New York. If you have any idea where that is in the U.S. And we actually just recently started opening up because vaccines have been pretty plentiful here. Luckily, I was able to get one as well. So it's starting to get a little back to normal over here, but we're still in that phase of like people aren't 100% ready for it. It's an interesting time to live.
Yeah, it's very much the same over here. We've had, especially in Scotland, we've had fairly strict restrictions, but it's kept the rate kind of relatively low. So we've been, touch wood, like we've been relatively safe compared to, especially down in parts of England, have been a lot worse affected. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to, now things are starting to open up little by little, and the rules are getting more and more relaxed. So yeah, looking forward to everything being open again, being able to go out and enjoy the town.
I guess a little just life conversation for a second. We're starting to do cons over here. I'm actually going to be doing one here in August. Has there even been conversation over there with that kind of stuff? Or are you guys still just like, let's just hold off?
I think people are sort of edging into it. I think tentatively, the Thought Bubble Festival, which happens up in Yorkshire, that's going ahead this year, I've heard. But there's still a lot of, there's a little uncertainty around things. So my new book just launched a couple of weeks ago. We'd hoped to do an in-person event in bookshop, get everyone together, do signings and all that sort of thing. But at the last minute, unfortunately, we felt it was a little safer to do things on Zoom.
Yeah, it's a tough decision. I mean,
yeah,
you got to do what's best, but I miss just going out and meeting people and talking to people and shaking hands and kissing babies and doing all that fun stuff.
Yeah, I think I'm very much the same. Like, I know the stereotype of a graphic novelist is often, introverted people who prefer to be alone and work alone on these things. But I love nothing more than going to, in previous years, going to things like TCAF up in Toronto and like meet 100 people in a day, like chat to loads of people, go out and party in the evening. Like that's all like the dream for me. And it's such a shame to like not have had that opportunity.
Yeah, hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon. Yeah.
So let's start here. Give us kind of your origin story. Were you always a big comics person? And if so, like when along the line were you like, hey, I could probably make these things?
It's an interesting story actually. Growing up, I wasn't really a comics person. I grew up in a small village in the northeast of Scotland, in like a really rural area. So there weren't really kind of comic book shops around. I wasn't really sort of attached to that culture, but I was into, like, as a teenager, I was into a lot of like sort of comic adjacent things. So into a lot of video games, into like sort of tabletop games, that sort of thing. But it wasn't until I actually went to art school. I went to Edinburgh College of Art in the capital city of Scotland, and I studied illustration there. And I've always really enjoyed writing. I've always really enjoyed sort of reading novels. And I think it was maybe at the start of art school, discovering books like The Watchmen, obviously is this the classic that everyone is drawn to, and books like Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. For me, that really that was like a wake-up call, because I enjoyed writing and I enjoyed drawing, and it was suddenly this obvious thing of, oh, why didn't I put these two things together? And I could try telling these amazing stories that like these amazing authors are telling. It was, I remember it being, as a sort of 18, 19-year-old student, discovering sort of comics and graphic novels for the first time and finding it really, really exciting. So that was sort of my path into it. Came a little bit later than some people who, really get into comics as teenagers. But yeah, I think it was through art school and through studying illustration that I got that kind of connection.
Well, and with that, like we talked about on the show quite a few times, how I myself, like my path in the comics was like watching Batman animated series and all these things that we have over here, and how it's always been kind of part of the culture, even though some people don't really recognize that it's always been a part of the culture. So for you over there, like, were these things around? Like, did you know about superheroes or comic books, or is it like, what is the scene over there?
I think certainly growing up, I didn't know, and this is probably mostly because I grew up in like this rural area in the countryside. I knew, I like knew who Batman and Superman were and stuff, but there wasn't like an entry point to getting into the comics. Similarly, with sort of, I don't know, with sort of animated series or like anime things. I had one friend when I was growing up who had had like cable TV, and he could watch like Dragon Ball Z all the time, and I was like, what is this amazing looking thing? But like, I didn't watch enough of it to sort of have a sense of what the story was, like who the characters were. You just catch like an episode here and there. So at that time, I wasn't so connected to it. I think that maybe, I mean, this might be unfair to say because obviously in the UK there are a lot of people who are really passionate about comics, but my impression is that the comic and graphic novel world is bigger both in the USA and Canada, and also bigger in France and Belgium, and that the UK is sort of a, we don't maybe quite have the same like core readership or the same sort of market for of comic readers that we do in other countries. I mean, there's a lot of really good British graphic novelists, British illustrators, but there's maybe fewer publishers as well. I mean, certainly I'm published by Top Shelf Comics, who are based over in the USA, and I've always had a great relationship with Top Shelf. But I think one of the things that drew me as well instinctively to an American publisher was that there aren't that many British publishers, and the ones that we have are obviously great. There's a lot of really good British books being published, but there's not the same maybe breadth of British publishers that there are in the US.
Yeah, I mean, just for someone who's been doing this for a while and has been in comics for a while, the only one that comes to mind is really 2000 AD.
Yeah, there's things like Jonathan Cape, who are an imprint of Penguin Random House, who are very much on the sort of literary comics end of the spectrum. Indie publishers like Nobrow, who are quite big, but like, they produce a lot of really amazing work. But at the same time, if there's only a limited number of publishers and they're only publishing a limited number of books per year, I think especially if you're like a new graphic novelist and you've got your first script or your first like story idea, it can be difficult to get your foot in the door with like one of the few publishers and be like, publish my work.
Yeah, we're here. You just drive down the street and there's someone publishing comics. Feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always amazed, whenever I've been to, any like festival or convention or whatever in America, I'm amazed by the amount of like, amazing like high level big publishers, but also the number of like really cool indie comics that are being published.
Yeah, and things like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, stuff like that is really just blown that wide open over here, at least. So let's jump in a little bit into the book that you're here to talk about, The Delicacy. Let's start with like, explain to my listeners and viewers, what is The Delicacy?
So The Delicacy tells the story of two brothers who leave their sort of rural, remote island on the west coast of Scotland and decide to move to London to open a restaurant. Their plan is that the older brother, Rowan, is going to kind of run a market garden. He's going to produce high quality, delicious, organic, vegetables to be then cooked and served by Tulip, his younger brother, at their restaurant in London. Initially, the plan sort of doesn't quite, the restaurant doesn't really take off. This idea that they're bringing wholesome, organic, healthy food to what they see as this like corrupted, big, polluted city, and doesn't initially catch on. People are already in a big city like London or a big city like New York. People are already very familiar with organic food, and there's not enough wow factor. But then on Rowan's farm, they discover this new species of mushroom growing, and the mushroom turns out to be this insatiably delicious, fantastic success, and that blows the lid right off the restaurant. The younger brother, Tulip, quickly becomes much wealthier, much busier, and he sort of starts riding this wave of like wealth and luxury and success. And the more he rides this wave, the less he wants to get off, the more he's willing to sort of sacrifice his initial principles of wholesome organic food to just keep the the fame and the money coming in. So that's the sort of setup of the book, which leads the two brothers into a rift or into sort of an emotional disaster.
So yeah, the first thing that really attracted me to the book was what you're talking about. It's food comics are very common in like manga, But when you talk about the more traditional American market, you don't see it a whole lot. So I guess what I want to ask is like, are you also a foodie? Is that why this kind of idea was drawn to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it seemed like a really natural thing to write about because food is very much something that, I mean, obviously everybody eats. Like, there's no getting away from that. And I think there's a lot that can be said about food, both in a sort of almost from any angle. You can talk about like high class, fancy, expensive restaurants that are really posh. You can talk about like simple takeout food. You can talk about simple home cooking. You can talk about food as a sort of class status or as a way to like show off your wealth, and at the same time you can talk about food as just this functional thing that you need to do to live. And all of these sort of elements of the different ways to approach food, are we concerned with our health, are we concerned with, you know, luxury and expensive heavy tastes, are we concerned with showing off, are we concerned with just having something to keep our bodies alive? All of these things are interesting themes to explore. And I've personally always, like, I'm a real sort of restaurant foodie. I love going to restaurants. And I've also always done a lot of observational drawing. So I'll go to a restaurant or go to a bar and I've got a little sketchbook in my pocket. And while I'm waiting for my food to come, I'll just sit and draw the other diners or draw the, especially if it's a restaurant with like an open kitchen, you know, draw the chefs working away, which is really fun for me. So the idea of drawing a book set in restaurants and set between the sort of luxurious surroundings that the diners are sitting in, and then the extremely hardworking, chaotic surroundings that the chefs are cooking in is like a really fun contrast. So, yeah, the subject matter of restaurants is like a really natural one for me and something that I find really fun. And hopefully, you know, anyone who enjoys eating out or anyone who sort of thinks about their sort of the food culture that they're in, you know, will find it interesting as well.
Well, it's something that we almost take advantage of a little bit. Where like food is a direct, I see food as a direct lens into somebody's culture. Because like you can even inside the states, I know I have friends who are chefs and have gone to culinary school, and they went to culinary school and they told people, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but they've told people about the upstate New York garbage plate, and people are just like, what is this thing? Like, and why do you call it a garbage plate?
What is a garbage plate? This sounds amazing.
It is amazing. It is mac salad and then some sort of potato, usually home fries. You can do French fries. Sometimes you do beans. You can mess around with it a little bit, but the basic idea is the mac salad and the fries. And then you put some sort of meat over top of it. We usually do burgers. And then we put a meat sauce over it. And then from there, it's your own imagination. You can throw ketchup, mustard, whatever you want on it. But it literally looks like you just end up cutting it all up, mixing it together, and that's where it gets the name, because it looks like a plate of garbage. But it tastes amazing, and it's the most.
Yeah.
It's a very American thing, but it's just one of those things where people don't really appreciate that much the culture that comes through food. So you're coming from Scotland. You're talking about a restaurant in London. I'm assuming that we're going to deal with a lot of England-based foods or culture in that way.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, it's funny because I think internationally, Britain sort of doesn't have a great reputation for its food culture, especially within Europe. You know, we're right next to, you know, France, Italy, Spain, these countries with incredible food, and the you know, you may know this the sort of stereotypical, you know, mocking name that French people have for British people is le roast beef, like roast beef, because it's like all we eat: roast beef, fish and chips. And sort of British food is maybe traditionally known for being quite bland. But then I think in reality, one of the things that makes especially food in sort of urban parts of Britain, in big cities, really exciting is, you know, a place like London is so culturally diverse. And actually British food at its best is when we combine foods from all sorts of different countries that, you know, people have come to Britain from, or like there's a slightly darker side to the sort of cultural history, because also a lot of it comes from colonialism, and that we, you know, hundreds of years ago invaded these countries, that has left like a lasting legacy. But I think that food is a really interesting way to explore this sort of cross-pollination of cultures, you know, that exists in Britain or exists in other European nations. And I think that sort of cross-pollination of all sorts of different influences, whether it's you know, French influences of French food and Italian food in Britain, influences of South Asian food or East Asian food, they're all really, really interesting, and they're all really, you know, it's what makes British food culture in London, especially, really, really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, living in America, we do have our few. Barbecue's the big one. Everybody knows barbecue, and barbecue's worldwide. But like when you think barbecue, you usually think Southern America. But most of our food is the same way. It's a cultural appropriation of different people's foods
Yeah.
and different people's cultures and bringing it in. The fancy word we use around here is fusion. So when you go to an Asian fusion restaurant, it's us mixing things together. So it's always it's interesting to go into a big city and see all these great foods and
Yeah,
cultures.
absolutely. And I think for me that was an interesting sort of cornerstone of the approach for the book, because the two main characters have come from rural Scotland, and especially somewhere in the in the north of Scotland, the climate is so cold that you're fairly limited in the sort of produce you can grow. You can't grow tomatoes or grapes or these sorts of these things that make things like Italian food really exciting. Scottish food is maybe leans fairly heavily on the turnips and the potatoes and things. And so for the characters arriving in London and seeing this sort of multitude of different cultures and fusions and food from different countries and from their limited background, countries that they themselves haven't even heard of, is meant to be one of the really sort of exciting cornerstones of the book. And hopefully a way to look at the excitement that can come from sharing food and sharing food culture, which I think is really, really important.
Yeah, and then I think the second thing that drew me into the book when I was reading it was the art. Obviously, you're an artist, so when you're drawing this book and you have this very, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't even know how to describe your style. It's not watercolors. Are you using charcoal pens for this?
No, it's actually watercolor and gouache. So you've got a bit of that watercolor look, but the gouache is giving a sort of heavier, more opaque sort of color form to it, I think.
Okay, so that's where I'm getting both of those from then. So I was on the right track.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I were to draw only in watercolor, it can end up looking a little bit light. It's difficult to get into these really dark, bold tones. Whereas gouache, because it's that bit more opaque, really like gives you that extra thing. But for me, what's really important, because I'm not at all digitally minded. I'm really sort of using a computer for me is always a bit of a headache. So I try and do absolutely as much of the page as I can just in real life. So I draw it about 50% bigger than it appears in the finished comic, and I just draw the entire page, panel borders and all, and try and make it as exactly as it will appear in the finished book, to avoid having to do any sort of digital recoloring or sort of recomposing using Photoshop or anything. Because for me, that's always a little bit of a headache. Whereas, drawing organically and putting things directly on the page is really delightful and really exciting.
And I wonder how much of this you studied, and I'm assuming you did in college, but your faces, like even when it's a background character and it's a simple like 3 or 4 lines, you always are able to show some sort of emotion through the faces, and that's something that's very rare, at least that I see in comics. And maybe you want to speak on that, on how emotion really was important to you in this book, assuming it was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think with all storytelling, really, the core of the crux of the story has to be some sort of emotional conflict or some sort of emotional state that has to be relatable to the reader. Whether or not the book is set in a restaurant, or if it's set in a sort of Lord of the Rings style fantasy land, or whether it's set in space, the characters need to have some sort of emotional interaction that any reader can sort of relate to, and then it's an emotional reaction that gets extrapolated to make a dramatic story. Not everyone has opened a restaurant in London and then fallen out with their brother over a conflict of wealth and greed and jealousy, but everyone has had some sort of relationship with someone where they felt a little jealous at times or a little conflicted at times. And I think that taking those emotions and sort of extrapolating them into the kind of backbone of the story is what leads to writing that resonates with people. In terms of putting the emotion in faces, it really comes from my art school training, which was, I did my undergrad at Edinburgh College of Art and then did a postgrad at the Royal Drawing School in London, both of which involved a huge amount of sort of observational drawing. So as I say, I'm sort of going to bars and restaurants and cafes, or just going out in the street with a sketchbook. And if you're drawing people just walking down the street, you have to get the sort of essence of a figure in like 30 seconds or something. Just as they walk past, you just get a few lines, and that really taught me about how to like show a person's emotion or show their form or show their movement in as few lines as possible. And I really think that that's sort of like, just go out for an afternoon with a sketchbook, draw as many people as you possibly can, do it as quickly as possible. Like, don't stress about the final look, but just sort of have that rigorous sort of reiterative approach was the best sort of education in drawing that I ever had. So that's my number one recommendation for sort of aspiring illustrators.
Doing that over these past 18 months must have been tough.
Yeah. Well, people are a lot more, over the last 18 months, there were a lot more sort of quiet, empty landscapes and a lot less busy bars in my sketchbook.
Well, and that was one thing that we missed as just humans, be able to look someone in the face. When I don't know how you guys handled it over there, but a lot of over here was the mask, wearing a mask when you go out, and so half of people's faces were just, we didn't see them.
Yeah,
which is an interesting experience for me, because then you're looking people more in the eyes and really trying to like get emotion through the eyes. It was fascinating.
Yeah. But I've definitely found myself, thinking I'm looking nicely and smiling at someone, but I'm wearing a mask, and so it looks like, they can't see my smile. They think I've just got some sort of really intense, stare going on or something. But it's funny, I was just saying to my friends the other day, actually, one of the things I've sort of missed is it's almost having like life going on in the background. Certainly with the restrictions here, it's been possible to kind of go out. You can go out and meet, I think, up to 4 other people or up to 6 other people outdoors. You can go to the park and sit at a picnic bench and just chat to someone, see your friends on a kind of one-to-one basis. But I've missed hanging out with friends in a bar and there being all these other people and all this other sort of chatter going on around. I really like that sort of, if there's a lull in your conversation, you can see, someone's, there's people flirting at the bar, there's someone's had a bit too much, who's staggering over a bit, people are watching the football and like yelling, and having that sort of background drama going on. I didn't realize how much I missed it until it was suddenly taken away from me.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I was noticing earlier too, like Delicacy that is out now. People can order at their local comic shops. It actually, here in America, you can order at local comic shops. I'm sure it's available in Amazon and other. Do you guys have like independent local comic shops over there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole sort of network of them in the UK, and then also, I think because in a sense the Delicacy is also more in the sort of, there's a crossover into the kind of literary world. I certainly find, a lot of it's also stocked by a lot of kind of more independent literary bookshops who kind of branch into graphic novels. So there's a nice crossover there, I think. But yeah, I mean, I really believe in sort of supporting independent retailers. So I definitely encourage people to, find their independent comic shops and, support the independent shops in their kind of immediate communities.
Yeah, as much as I love the comic shops, if you have a local comic shop, support them, because that's the bread and butter of what we do here. But local bookshops here in America, man, they're a dying breed. I have one in my hometown. It's still amazing that it's been 40 years since they opened, that they're still around, because even watch the big guys, the Borders bookstores and all them, they can't support it. You also had 2 other books on here that I saw, A Shining Beacon and Her Bark, Her Bite. Yeah. Are those also published by Top Shelf?
Yeah, absolutely. So Her Bark and Her Bite was actually my first, that was my first comic. That was my sort of final project from my postgrad in the Royal Drawing School down in London. So yeah, I was really lucky that I made the whole comic as part of this course, which really, was a really exciting sort of masterclass in writing and drawing. And then, yeah, I was lucky enough that Chris at Top Shelf Comics was interested in it and decided to publish it. So that was a really nice first step into the world of publishing graphic novels. And similarly, that's a book that very much is about this sort of delightful world of people going out to restaurants and going out to bars and partying and spending too much money and living luxurious life, which is so much fun to illustrate.
And so is Top Shelf really the only publisher you've worked with so far?
Yeah, so far, yes. I mean, in my other work as an illustrator, when I'm not writing, I've also worked with the Folio Society, who are a publisher here in Britain, who publish sort of classic novels, sort of in nice hardback editions with beautiful illustrations. So I've been lucky enough to do some really interesting illustration projects with them as well. I think for me, illustrating that sort of classic literature is always a really nice sort of callback to almost like the traditions of writing. I was lucky enough to do illustrations for Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, which is like one of the greatest novels in American literature. Yeah. And I think having a connection, being allowed to sort of draw for such a great novel is a kind of really nice reminder of sort of where I've come from as an illustrator, and like where our whole English language writing tradition comes from. And it's a lovely kind of project to work on as well.
That's really cool. Yeah. The best laid plan of Mice and Men. I think I say at least once a week. Yep. So yeah, you've done all this really cool stuff. Obviously the comics with Top Shelf. I'm actually really fascinated with doing drawings for classic literature. I wish they did more of that over here. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's always a shame. I think back up until maybe the sort of 1910s, it was, almost all adult novels were illustrated, and it would just be the standard thing, have a few, nice black and white ink drawings in there. And it's a shame that they've sort of moved. I think probably in the sort of interwar period, publishers moved away from having illustrated books because of the expense. But it's a shame to have that sort of austerity. It's really exciting to have good illustrations in adult novels as well. And I feel there's been a real renaissance in like beautiful book cover design, so hopefully it will move to beautiful illustrations inside novels as well, but we'll see.
Yeah, people are getting back into especially the hardbound, the gold plated editions of books, and it's nice.
Yeah, I think there was a time I remember sort of maybe 10-15 years ago, there was this sort of mass panic that the Kindle was going to destroy the printed book, and that I actually remember my family for Christmas one year, like everyone got each other Kindles, and then Christmas the following year, everybody just got each other printed books, because sending somebody a downloadable PDF on a Kindle like isn't a very nice present. Whereas I think maybe it caused people to appreciate what they really like about books, that like there's a beautiful physicality to like holding a well-crafted object. Holding like a nice book in your hands and having it to sort of cherish is really nice, whether it's a comic book, graphic novel, an illustrated novel. But yeah, people like to have that sort of beautifully designed physical book in their hands, and I think it's quite nice to sort of be reminded of that, really.
Yeah, it's funny how history repeats itself, because I remember that, and now we're going through that today with Comixology and digital comics, and the printed comic is going to die, and I'm just like, I've heard this before.
Yeah, we've all we've all lived through cycles of this. I think that as long as people love seeing physical things in their hands, love holding a comic and cherishing it, it's not a feeling that can be replaced.
Yeah, so everybody, the Delicacy, as well as all of James's other work, I'm sure, is available on Amazon, your local comic shops, and your local bookstores. I'll also have a link down below for, I actually don't know if this app has made it over to Europe or not, but for my American listeners, the Pullbox app with the link to it where you can just subscribe and send your orders straight to your local comic shop, and a link to all of James's stuff. But other than your website and Top Shelf, do you have like any social media that you want people to follow to keep up with you?
Yeah, if anyone wants to follow me on Instagram, then I'm at jamesalbon.illustration.
I'm used to people following that on Twitter. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm not on Twitter anymore. My sensitive soul can't take the argument.
Yeah, Twitter's tough. We shouldn't be on Twitter. But James, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's always nice to get a new perspective on the world of comics and meet some awesome people. So I appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully we can do this again someday.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show.